I'm Jeremy Siegel, and joining me from the Boston Public Library is Marie Yovanovitch. Yovanovitch is a career diplomat, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, author of the memoir Lessons from the Edge, and was at the center of the first impeachment trial of former U.S. President Donald Trump. Ambassador Yovanovitch, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So I'd love to start with politics because we are officially in the throes of the 2024 presidential race. From your perspective and your experience in foreign policy, what is at stake in this presidential election?
Well, I think there's a lot at stake, and I'll just confine it to foreign policy, which is kind of my realm. I think that Joe Biden has done a really good job of reestablishing our partnerships with allies and partners all over the world. And that is hugely important because although we are a very great country and we can do a lot, we can't do it on our own. We rely on those partnerships to advance our interests all over the globe. And so I think that that is something really important we need to be thinking about. We don't want to be America first and America alone. We want to be America first with the entire world.
You worked under the administration of former President Trump, whose policy was America first. How does that differ from what we've seen under President Biden?
Well, I think that President Biden has put a real emphasis on working with partners, working with allies. I think that's important. I think, crucially, he has provided very strong support to Ukraine, and I hope that that continues because the war in Ukraine, Russia's war on Ukraine, I should say, is, I think it's a test. Not only for Ukraine, but for the entire free world. Because if Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia will keep on going. And that is not in our interests because he will be, Putin will be advancing on countries that have been independent for years, sometimes centuries, and some of them are going to be NATO allies. And how do we know this? Because Putin has told us this. He's told us this in his writings, he's told us this in his speeches, and I, for one, see no reason to disbelieve him.
You mentioned funding for Ukraine. Right now, Congress and the White House are negotiating more funding for the country's war efforts. What would happen if something like that didn't pass?
Well, I prefer to think about it as that it will pass, that the Congress, both parties, are negotiating with the president, and I believe that they will eventually come to a deal, and I hope that's sooner rather than later, because delay creates problems. Delay sends a message to the entire world that we are perhaps abandoning Ukraine, even though I don't think we will. It sends a message that we are uncertain and unreliable, and that is a message that is sent to allies who are worried and to our adversaries like China, like Russia, who are delighting in this. And anytime Putin is reveling in what we are doing here in this country, we need to be doing a strong gut check on where our policies are and where our actions are. So I think we will get there. I think we need to get there sooner rather than later.
The U.S. has already spent $70 billion roughly on Ukraine. I think it can feel somewhat abstract to people watching from America when there's a war going on across the world.
Yeah.
You have firsthand experience in Ukraine. Where does that money go?
Yeah, well, so here's the interesting thing. I think it's, of course, crucially important for us to support Ukraine. And we have been spending a lot of money, and we're talking about spending a lot more money on Ukraine. But that money, actually 90% of it, stays right here in the United States, creating jobs for American citizens and bolstering our economy. Secondly, that money, as big as that amount is, we're talking about $61 billion on the table right now, as much as that money is, it is only 10%, maybe even less, of our annual defense budget. Not even our budget, of our annual defense budget. And that is money well spent.
I want to go back to what you mentioned about jobs at home. How does that money contribute to jobs in the U.S.?
Because the security systems and other kinds of security assistance we provide to Ukraine and to other countries for that matter as well, we talk about it in budgetary terms, the millions, the billions, but it's not like we write out a check and say, here, Ukraine, go ahead and spend this money. We don't do that. We provide them with actually the physical security systems that are usually made here in the United States, all over the United States, probably in every state in the Union.
At the same time as the war in Ukraine, there's also the war in Gaza, Israel's war with Hamas, which has not only been competing for national attention and competing for funding from the US, but also I imagine must be a strain on the State Department, given your years of experience in diplomacy from the American side. Is it exhausting for US officials? I mean, I see Secretary of State Antony Blinken getting off of planes at press conferences, at negotiations every day. That must be tiring.
I think I don't want to speak for him, but I'll just say from my perspective, it is tiring, but it's also invigorating because the work we do matters. The work we do saves lives. It makes a difference in people's life every day in other ways as well. And so, which would you rather do? Kind of a humdrum job that you're not really excited about, or a job that you find intellectually and otherwise stimulating and can really make a difference for the United States and for other countries around the globe.
How does that strain, though, affect the attention of the State Department and also funding domestically for both of these wars? I mean, not to speak of them in a competitive kind of way, but they do both draw attention in different directions.
Yeah, they do. But usually the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, other foreign affairs agencies, national security agencies, we divide up the world geographically. And so the people who are working on the Middle East are generally different than the people who are working on European affairs. I'm not saying that as you go up the food chain to the President, the Secretary of State, and others, obviously they are, they deal with the entire world. But maybe they don't deal with every single detail in the implementation of every single thing. So there's a distribution of responsibilities.
I want to talk a little bit more about what is actually happening inside of Ukraine, because you spent so many years there working for the US as a diplomat. How have we seen Ukraine's government change over the past few years? Your time there was before the election of President Zelensky. Now there's a war happening. Zelensky is in office. What sort of shift have we seen in Ukraine? What's it actually like in that country? We sort of always only hear about it from the war perspective.
Well, I know you know this, but the war actually started in 2014, 2015. And there were then some negotiations. There was going to be a ceasefire. Russia never adhered to that and kept that war going on a simmer for the next years until 2022, when it decided to invade or re-invade, and the goal was to take over all of Ukraine. So when I was there from 2016 to 2019, Ukraine and Russia were fighting. It didn't necessarily always make the headlines here, but there were about 3 people who were killed, civilians as well as soldiers, every week. I mean, that is not insignificant. So Ukraine has been on a wartime footing for a long time. Obviously, there was a big shift in 2022 when Russia surrounded Ukraine with 200,000 soldiers, all that equipment, and went in with the goal of taking over the entire country. And so you'd think that it would be hard to govern a country at war with so many challenges, and I am sure it is. But the Ukrainian economy still works. The government is providing services to the people. People, are being treated in hospitals. Kids are going to school. Banks are open. Stores are stocked. Restaurants are full. For a lot of people, it's fairly normal in much of Ukraine, unless there's an attack on your city. Unless you've got a loved one at the front lines, which is probably both of those occurrences are probably affect most of the people in Ukraine. So on the one hand, it's very normal. On the other hand, it's not normal at all. And you've got an entire nation that is dealing with huge loss, huge anger, huge grief, but also the positive side is that the Ukrainians are united. They continue to be united in their resolve to push the Russians back out of their territory, and they are fighting. They are fighting on.
You've met President Zelensky. You wrote about it in your memoir. Mm-hmm. He has a history previously in entertainment, and so many of us see him on television day in and day out, negotiating, talking about the war efforts in Ukraine. What's he like? And does that background in entertainment play into how he's able to lead the nation and keep the spotlight on Ukraine?
Yeah. So, Zelensky, I knew him as a comedian, as a candidate. I didn't work with him as president. But he, when I first met him, he was very focused on the fact that I needed to understand that he was a businessman. Yes, he was a comedian. Yes, he was an actor. But his real talents lay in business. He had created a multimedia media empire and, provided content for the entire Russian-speaking world. And that company is worth millions, and he got it. He earned that money, and he is very proud of that and remains very proud of it. And so I think, just like President Ronald Reagan, who of course famously was an actor before he became governor of California and then president, I think Zelensky has used that background in communications, that ability to get everybody on side to the great benefit of Ukraine.
Having met him as a comedian, would you have expected at the time that this man would become president of Ukraine and be leading it through a war?
I wouldn't have before about 2018, but in 2018 there were public opinion polls that were starting to come out, and he, as well as another entertainer, a singer by the name of Vakarchuk, were both polling really well. I mean, they had huge name recognition. Both were beloved. And so that's when I really started paying attention. But in the beginning, no, I didn't think he was going to be president.
I want to turn back to politics. You are now a former U.S. ambassador.
Yeah.
You've retired from the Foreign Service.
Mm-hmm.
When you are an ambassador, you steer away from domestic politics. Now that you're no longer in that realm, are you able to speak more freely about what's happening in the U.S.? Do you feel a freedom in what you're able to say?
Now I'm worried that you're going to ask me like a really tricky question.
I might be.
So yeah, I mean, now I'm a private citizen. I can say, whatever I want, which is, on the one hand, very different. On the other hand, very freeing.
You were at the center of former President Trump's first impeachment trial. It's not a role that diplomats usually end up in, having the national spotlight on them. But you were sitting there. You were inside of the congressional chambers as the Senate was launching and conducting an historic impeachment inquiry into a sitting U.S. president. Having sat there and having experienced the Trump administration, what goes through your mind as you're watching him on television, on the news once again, going through this 2024 presidential primary?
Well, obviously we're all watching the polls, and we saw, his victory in Iowa, and presume that those victories will continue to rack up. I mean, I think he is the presumptive Republican nominee. And I just recall that he used his office, his public office, the highest office in the land, to try to use it against a potential rival in the coming presidential elections in 2020 against former Vice President Joe Biden. He used that office for personal gain, and he used our foreign policy assets, our national security assets, in this case javelins, to try to get the Ukrainian president to do his personal and political bidding. I think the American people can expect better than that.
Why did you remain in your position under Trump when you disagreed so strongly with what he was doing?
Well, my job in Ukraine was to implement U.S. policy on Ukraine. And while I was there from 2016 to 2019, that policy was actually a very good policy, and in some ways, it was the same policy, frankly, that we've been following before under President Obama. And in some ways, you could say that President Trump strengthened it because he, in 2018, he agreed to provide javelins to Ukraine. So the perfect phone conversation with Zelensky where he talked about holding, he hinted that he would hold on to the javelins until Zelensky did his bidding. That was a second allotment of javelins. And sending that first shipment of javelins to Ukraine was hugely important. It sent a signal to both Russia and Ukraine that the US had Ukraine's back. So that was really, really important. So when I was ambassador, our policy was a policy I could get behind. I don't think there's any American that agrees with even a president that they vote for 100% of the time. And so, I was focused on my job, and in my job, I thought that we were doing the right thing with regard to our national security concerns and that we were helping Ukraine. Subsequently, after I was removed from Ukraine, that's when this, strange phone call happened, and it became clear what President Trump was trying to do.
You wrote about your experience in your memoir and how difficult it was, feeling like you'd be up against unstoppable forces speaking out about what you saw happening with the Trump administration, and what you said was efforts to influence domestic policy wrongly through Ukraine. Rudy Giuliani was at the center of all of that, and you wrote that, can you imagine speaking ill of the man who led New York City through the aftermath of 9/11? We've seen such a shift in who Rudy Giuliani is since then. What has it been like watching that figure who was so at the center of a very turbulent experience for you? What's that been like, seeing that unfold over the past
years?
Well,
I think it's tragic in some ways. America's mayor, I mean, he led New York City and had the attention of America and the world after 9/11. And I think it's tragic to see the path that he has chosen for himself and the things that he has done, betraying our country's values.
Do you think that Trump would do something like he did in Ukraine again if he were reelected? What was at the center of the first impeachment trial?
I think we don't exactly know what Trump would do. I mean, what he said as a candidate this time around is that he would solve this crisis in 24 hours. And Russia has made it very clear that they hope former President Trump will be president again, because I think they anticipate that our assistance for Ukraine would stop. That would put Ukraine in an untenable position and strengthen Russia.
What would the situation look like? You spoke earlier about your fears of Russia's war in Ukraine spreading, which I think is somewhat unimaginable to many of us. What does that actually look like? I mean, could we see invasions of more countries in Europe?
Yeah. Well, if you look at what President Putin has written, if you look at what he has said that he wants to consolidate historically Russian lands, is what he calls it, historically Russian lands. And if you look at a map over the centuries, that's a lot of Europe, right? That he wants to consolidate those territories under Russia. He's said that, he's written it, and if you look at what he has done, in 2008, he took two hunks of the country of Georgia. 2014, 2015, he invaded Ukraine for the first time, took Crimea, took parts of the Donbass. 2022, we know what he's done. I see no reason to disbelieve him. I think that he does have broader ambitions, and he has publicly talked about, of course, that Ukraine is not a country, there are no Ukrainian people, but he has said the same thing about Kazakhstan, a oil and gas wealthy nation. And it's possible that he could go for, there's speculation in the Russian media, Moldova, Belarus, consolidate the gains he's made in Belarus. I think he is a very ambitious man. I'm not saying this would happen, right after a victory in Ukraine, should that terrible day come, which I don't think it will. But I think that he would, rest, recoup, rearm, and go for more, because if that were to happen, that he gets a victory in Ukraine, it would be because the free world has not supported Ukraine, that we are not standing up for our values, we're not standing up for our partners, we're not even standing up for our own interests. And so why wouldn't he do what he wants to do? Because he would have understood that there is no punishment to that, there is no cost to breaking the rules of international discourse between nations. Moreover, it's not just Putin who will understand that. Other countries will as well. And so while I'm not a China expert, I think the road to sorting out the China-Taiwan issue drives straight through Ukraine.
Before I let you go, I briefly wanted to ask about your family, because you have firsthand experience with an aggressive Russia. Your parents fled from the USSR. They fled from the Nazi terror. How does that influence your approach to foreign policy and how you're making sense of this situation?
Well, I think that, I'm an optimist. I think most Americans are optimists. We want to believe the best in people, but we also need to be realists, and we also need to understand that that terrible things do happen, and we need to stand up against it, because if Russia has its way, the brutal ways that Russia is dealing with the Ukrainian people under occupation, the brutal ways that it's dealing with its own population will become normalized, and we will see that around the world. We can't stand for that.
Former U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy.